Okay, here we are in Psychology of Money, and for this week, I am super excited that we have a special guest, Dr. Shauna Reilly from the Department of Political Science at NKU has joined us because this week we're going to talk about psychology, politics, and money. So thank you, Dr. Reilly, for joining us. We're really excited to hear what you have to say. Just a little bit of background for students. Your background is political science, and you do have expertise in voter behavior, which is nicely overlapping with what we're learning this week.
Good.
So thank you for being here. So I thought, first of all, we just talk about what is political science, because some of the students in my class probably have never taken a class in political science. And can you tell us a little bit about what kind of classes you teach at NKU?
Sure. So what the common misperception about political science is all we do is sit around and talk about politics. But actually, there's a little bit more to it. So we are indeed studying the sort of who, what, when, and why of politics. So who gets elected? Why do they get elected? When do they get elected? And then, of course, all of the underlying sort of tones to that and the processes and historical norms to some extent, not as much history, but sort of trends in political behavior. And then specifically, I teach political behavior. So we talk about political knowledge, we talk about why people vote, how they vote, when they vote, like midterms or not, so that kind of stuff. We also talk about public opinion, which is a hot topic these days. Are the polls right? Are they wrong? All of that is coming up in my class, and I shudder to think how that's going to go. But nonetheless, that's part of my repertoire. And then I teach state and local politics. So looking at elections at a state level. So because most of, if not all of the processes are done at the state level.
So that's a great segue to my next question, because all of the things you just mentioned are all the things that we're interested in. And so I'd like to pull in the money piece now and talk about what do voters think about when they are voting or thinking about the next election when it comes to their personal finances and then also maybe the general economy? What are they thinking?
So that's a great question. And when we think about voter evaluation of the economy, there are those two different perspectives. So the one is the sociotropic, or what I like to call the pocketbook approach, like how my pocketbook is doing right now. So that often influences our perception of the economy and how we're going to vote. It may be that the economy is doing great, but I lost my job. And that to me has a bigger impact on my pocketbook. And so that's how I'm going to say that the performance of the incumbent's doing. So oftentimes we use it as sort of my lens reflects other people's voting or other people's performance. The other perspective is retrospective voting, where we look at the incumbent's past 4 years to decide whether or not what they have done in those 4 years has benefited me economically, or the people in my community economically, if we're thinking a little bit more broadly. So those two forces tend to be a challenge when it comes to voting, because often they can be different, right? If you're looking at the current incumbent, perhaps you see the last 4 years as being very good economically, but you've lost your job because of COVID. So now how does that shape your view of the economy and the perceptions?
So does the pocketbook matter more than the general view of the economy?
Absolutely. I mean, yeah. And even like you could tell me the economy is doing great. It doesn't matter if I'm going to lose my home. However, there are some folks who are able to see beyond their personal economic situation and say, like, I hope and I aspire to be part of the middle class. So I'm really excited that the economy is doing better. And like someday that's going to be me. And so there's also that sort of reflection too, that like aspirations get in there too about like, and the middle class is a discussion for, I think, later on maybe, but a challenge nonetheless when it comes to voting behavior.
Okay, so let's talk about another thing having to do with money, and that's the ads. So we know that so much money is spent on political ads. These cost a great deal of money. How does that actually influence voter behavior?
So no one ever loses from having too much money. But they do lose for not having enough. So when it comes to that election day, not having enough money is certainly critical. And we can see examples of that even in primary races when candidates have to loan themselves money to get themselves out of debt. Absolutely happens. So not having enough money, critical piece. Now, just to give you some context about what this election is going to cost us or is costing us, the expectations today is that we have spent or we will spend $11 billion on this election. That's campaign costs, commercials, pamphlets at the presidential level, but also all of the state and local races and PACs or political action committees. So a lot of that's big money. That's a lot of money to think about. I mean, it's hard to fathom 11 billion. And I was trying to get some comparisons to like what that could buy us, but that's like healthcare. That's a couple of days of war. Like there's just all kinds of things you could pay for with that money. Now, not to saying it's coming out of the government's money. That's not true. It's coming out of us. So we've decided to spend this kind of money. But that's a lot of money in this process. And a lot of people get concerned about the amount of money in campaigns because of that. Now, to get back to your original question, was our campaign ads actually effective? So the literature is really split on this. Some of the literature says, yes, it depresses turnout. So if you just see negative campaign ads all the time, it depresses turnout. People don't vote because of them. Well, then why would we show them? Because it depresses voters that might not vote for you. The other thing that we see is about political knowledge. Some people, this is the only knowledge they get about a candidate. And if that's the only information you're getting about a candidate, you're going to learn more from the negative campaign ads than you are from the positive, like, here's my family, here's my religion, yay, go America, right? We don't learn as much from that as we do from they lost money, they did this, they were terrible, right? We learn more about candidates when we hear about the negative stuff. So in terms of knowledge, we learned something, although maybe not necessarily the truth. And then there's some that say that you can't really measure the impact of campaign ads because they're not just in a vacuum, right? Like we also talk to people, we also have opinions outside of that. And so a lot of the research that's done on campaign ads is done in laboratories. And so you can't get a true understanding of its true impact because it's absence of that noise that we see on a daily basis.
So just a follow-up question from that then, even in the lab studies, are those negative ads more impactful than a positive ad, even in a lab, or is that mainly in real life?
So in the lab, you're going to see a bigger impact from the negative ads in terms of depressing turnout. Like, I just don't want to vote.
Oh, okay. Well, that explains a lot when you see so many negative ads on TV.
I would really like a button that says opt out, right? Like, especially after you voted, like, I no longer can be persuaded. Like, I have made my choice. I have paid for, please don't vote anymore. But, yeah. Okay. They're also really funny if you pay attention to them.
Yeah.
Really funny.
Yeah. You got to look at it with a sense of humor, I think. Otherwise, this comes to my next question. How does wealth or maybe the lack of wealth in various locations influence voter turnout? Because you did kind of allude to that in your last answer.
So higher socioeconomic status leads to higher turnout, or those with higher socioeconomic status are more likely to vote. So that means education, that means wealth. And we see that translated in various ways, right? So if you have higher levels of income, you are probably more likely to be able to take the time to go vote. You're more likely to be able to see the value of different aspects versus, having to work a 12-hour shift. Yes, your employer has to let you go vote, but maybe you don't want to take the time off, right? Or maybe you need to go get your kids and that's more important than voting. And I mean, life is important. So like all these things contribute to the costs of voting. And so definitely wealth impacts participation positively. And in terms of locations, I was thinking about this. Dr. Marczinski sent me some questions to think about so I could be ready and on the ball. One of the things you had asked about was sort of like location. So like, do certain areas turn out more as a result of that wealth distribution? And I thought about like our city centers. A lot of our city centers have low turnout. Sometimes because of where the voting booths are, they're harder to get to. There's not as much access. They're only open certain hours if they're open at all in those areas. Maybe we have reduced openness to our ability to get an ID in that neighborhood. And so all of that compounds those costs of voting and makes it more difficult to participate.
So this leads me to my last question, because I think it connects really well. In this election with COVID, there is going to be so much mail-in voting and early voting that never has happened before. So knowing what you know and your research on ballots and voter behavior, can you tell us a little bit about what you think might be happening, or what might change with voter behavior?
So we're recording this in mid-October, and the last report said that over 14 million or 15 million people had already voted. Mm-hmm. We still have weeks until election day. And I mean, I voted, I'm assuming others have too. And so all of that indicates that like what we do now in the rest of the campaign means less, right? Some people have already made their choice and voted. And if we have that many people voting this early, the expectation is we're going to have higher voter turnout. Awesome, which is great for democracy. Higher voter turnout, always awesome. Now, in terms of what that means in terms of voting or vote choice, typically folks who use early voting and who vote by mail are more likely to vote Democratic. It doesn't mean that's what they're doing, right? There's Republicans voting early, absolutely. Just typically that's what we see. The problem that mail-in voting and early voting presents is the cost. And I think that's a really good connection to your class, is the cost of early voting is one borne by the local precinct. So our local government has to pay for those election officials to stand there. They have to rent the building, they have to pay for the staff. That's an expensive endeavor. Now, even if they're having state money contributed, that's still a lot of money. I saw an analysis this morning that said that the estimated costs of the early voting and the mail-in voting is going to be $4 billion.
$4 billion.
Yes,
wow.
Above what we've already put aside. So in a year where we have a pandemic, we have fiscal issues up and down the governmental lines. This is as states run the entire election process. So states are making decisions about mail-in ballots, who pays for postage, even like the printing of the ballot is expensive. Now we need an envelope to send it out to people, an envelope for them to seal it in, an envelope for them to mail it back. That's more paper. It's just an increased cost that's borne on the state and the local districts. It's not money coming from the federal government to do that. And so that's a large issue. You also think about with the mail-in ballots, you have to have staff to like put it through the box, right? Like count it, put it through this. And then one of the recent challenges has been, when do we start counting? Some states are allowed to count as soon as they receive it. Some states start at some murky point before election day, but it's not clear. And some start on election day. So when do we start counting? Do we ever share those results? Who should know those results? Because if you tell me that my county has gone this way, am I going to turn out to vote? Is that going to depress turnout? It does in some countries. We're both from Canada, and when we were growing up, what they did is they actually had a media blockout. So you actually couldn't report the media or the election results in Western Canada until the polls had closed. Well, it's been a few years and you can't do that kind of media blockout anymore. And so trying to sort of talk about who's voting, when people are voting, the counts. We want to be very careful about that, especially because there's a possibility of a very close election. If it's a close election, then what happens to if it goes to the courts? All of these things are layered on. This morning, there was a discussion about mail-in or the like location you can drop your ballots in California. One was set on fire. There was some discussion over the weekend if the one party had put up fake ones so you could vote in those. All of those things are issues we haven't had to deal with before. And now we have this plus a close election, plus a pandemic. Like it's very overwhelming about what all this could mean in terms of the results on election day.
Well, certainly that tells me
And
that
not to be like a negative Nelly, but like there's like lots of things that are challenging right now.
yeah, definitely. And I certainly see that there's maybe more questions than answers. We may know more in 6 months, but wow, there's a lot of moving pieces. It's very complicated.
And I truly believe that we are doing our best when it comes to election administration. We have experts in this field. Hopefully all of them are being consulted and helping and doing what they can. I was really impressed when I went to early vote that they were printing off my ballot. So like they knew who I was, what ballot I got, here you go, vote there, scan there, and leave. Like that's very sophisticated versus like, here's a ballot. What county do you live in? And then like find the pile and then like, oh, wrong pile. Like it was much more sophisticated and it was very reassuring for me when I went and voted early. And I hope everyone has that experience as they're voting, that they feel reassured by the process.
Well, that's a great place to end because I think it leaves us on a positive note. So, and thank you very much, Dr. Reilly, for joining us. I think that it tells us a lot about the intersection between psychology and political science. It's two fields that certainly can pull in money and talk about it for a long period of time. There's certainly lots to still learn, I think. So thank you for joining us.
Happy to be here.